Christians just cherry pick all over the Bible. They eat bacon, wear blended fabrics, and ignore all those laws in Leviticus, but then suddenly quote the Bible when it's convenient. Hold up, that's not what's going on.
All right, let's see it.
The Bible makes a distinction between different kinds of laws. Oh yeah, and how's that? Think of it this way. Israel had moral laws like don't murder, don't steal. Those reflect God's unchanging character and still apply to everyone. But there were also ceremonial and civil laws, things about sacrifices, dietary restrictions, and Israel's national government. Those were temporary, meant to set Israel apart and point to Jesus.
So the Bible actually makes no such delineation whatsoever. These are post-biblical innovations that are then imposed upon the Bible. So the twofold division into moral and ceremonial is developed in the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE and then imposed upon the Bible. And then later on you had the assertion of a threefold division into moral, ceremonial, and civil, which again is then imposed upon the Bible. When you look in the Bible itself, you see a few different attempts to try to distinguish laws from one another. I think the Holiness Code in Leviticus might come the closest to actually asserting a twofold division of moral and ceremonial laws, but the division doesn't line up with the Christian division into moral and ceremonial. There are a lot of laws considered moral in the Holiness Code that would later be dismissed by Christians as ceremonial. And then when you get in the New Testament, you have a few different ways that people address the question of what parts of the Jewish law remain relevant and what parts do not. And you have the extremes like Matthew, who says that the law of Moses remains in effect and will be until the heaven and the earth pass away. Not only are Christians responsible for the whole law, we're even going to escalate several laws. You have heard that Moses said, don't do this. Well, I'm ratcheting it up. Don't even do this other thing. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have the folks who say, the whole law is gone. And then in between, you have attempts like the Jerusalem Council, Acts 15, verse 20. The results of the Jerusalem Council were that Gentile converts to following Jesus were no longer responsible for the law except for 4 things. Abstain from sexual immorality, from things sacrificed to idols, from blood, and from things strangled. A full 75% of the laws that the Jerusalem Council insisted Gentile converts to following Jesus had to follow were dietary restrictions, which doesn't line up with the moral ceremonial division that was developed in the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE. So we have a mixed bag of either not making any divisions at all or making divisions that don't line up with what later Christians would insist were the divisions all along. So this is very clearly just a post-biblical innovation.
Okay, so what's different today? Jesus fulfilled the sacrificial system by being the once-for-all sacrifice. That's in Hebrews 10. The dietary and ceremonial laws served their purpose. They are complete in Christ.
Well, the Jerusalem Council would disagree with you on that, given abstaining from things sacrificed to idols and from blood and from things strangled are all dietary restrictions.
But the moral law, that never expires. That's why Jesus reaffirmed things like marriage, love of neighbor, and honoring God above all. So you're saying Jesus affirmed the moral law, but said that he fulfilled all of the rest of it? Exactly. It's all about reading the law through the lens of fulfillment in Christ.
But this overlooks that in the Gospel of Matthew, for instance, Jesus also reaffirms things like tithing and Sabbath observance and ritual purity and dietary restrictions and making offerings at the temple and all those kinds of things. Now, we renegotiate that away because we're imposing this unifying framework of this 2- or 3-fold division that was developed after the Bible that we prefer. So we impose that on the text, and that allows us to hierarchize the text and say, well, this text over here takes priority of this other text, and so we can ignore those reaffirmations that Jesus made of features of the law of Moses. We can also just ignore that Jesus said his followers would have to be more righteous than the Pharisees in terms of their keeping the law of Moses. So the univocality of the Bible, the notion that this was all written into the text, the notion that this was all planned out and neatly divided up in the text is simply not true. The data do not support that at all. The data demonstrate that different authors of the biblical text had different perspectives about how to think of the division of the laws and how to negotiate between what laws are going to remain relevant now that Jesus is here and what laws are not. And the ways that Christians tend to approach it today are based overwhelmingly on these unifying frameworks and divisions of the law that were developed by Christians after the Bible had already been completed in the 2nd and 3rd and later centuries. That's just the renegotiation that is the most meaningful and useful for Christians, and so that's what's going to be authoritative. This isn't in the Bible. This is something that is imposed upon the Bible to make it seem like it is all inspired and inerrant and univocal and historical and authoritative. The reality is that the tradition, the received tradition, is the real authority that overrules what's actually in the Bible. And the fit for this video has been the Amazing Spider-Man.